next presentation, which is called Big Ideas for Innovation in Canada. And it is the fruit of a year's work by Dr. Mike Moffat from the Lawrence Centre and the Ivy School at the University of Western Ontario, and Dr. Hannah Rasmussen from Projection North, which is a think tank that's based in London, Ontario. As Mike would want me to point out, all of the real strong thinking on these fronts is happening in southwestern Ontario. And he's hoping to be the first governor, potentate, king of southwestern Ontario. I left Twitter because I got tired of him talking about it. But in conjunction with Canada 2020, Mike and Hannah have been doing consultations across the country on these important questions, and they're beginning to share some of the fruits of their labor. I believe we're going to start with a video showing what they've been up to, and then we're going to get them up here to talk about their findings. So let's do that.
So I think it's important that we tour the country, talk to different groups to make sure that we're getting a Canada-wide perspective and not just a central Canadian one.
We're able to take the strengths in the tech sector, but also the strengths we have in the industrial sector here, bring them together and see what new we can create.
We have to innovate every day to just stay in business.
We believe that innovation is enabled by creativity.
Very interesting, very broad, wide-ranging discussions, which is to be expected with a whole mixed group of people.
Innovation without collaboration is possible, but the road would be very bumpy, would be inefficient, would not be effective, and so collaboration all of a sudden creates significant value.
Dr. Moffat, Dr. Rasmussen, come on up. Tell us how you got roped into this project, how you went about it, and what you have come up with.
Well, Tim Barber is a very persuasive man. So when they were doing the first roundtable and first get-together back in the summer, I emailed Tim and I said, "Oh, that sounds kind of interesting. You know, if there's anything I can do to help out, you know, thinking, you know, maybe I could serve drinks or something like that." And quickly, I started working on these roundtables and started working on these projects. And the very first roundtable we did, we held at TD. It was a FinTech roundtable, and we had Andrew Graham there and a number of experts in this area. And they talked about a lot of things, but they talked a lot about data, open data, and they talked a lot about policy coherence. And I have to admit, those are two fields that I know absolutely nothing about. So I was sitting there having a lot of imposter syndrome, and not the normal type of imposter syndrome I have about 10 times a day, but really feeling like I had I just had no expertise in this area. But I happened to just be married to somebody who does that for a living. So at that point, I roped in Hannah and said, I need your help here because I'm drowning, I get some of this, I don't understand some of these other areas. And I think after that point, I would like to think we worked pretty well together and were able to combine our talents. And interestingly enough, we had both done PhDs at Ivy, never actually collaborated on anything before, and we are still talking to each other at this point.
I just want to ask the same question, but back it up a few years. How did you get roped into this whole getting married to Mike Moffat thing? But let's instead move closer to the present. I'm intrigued by the notion of big ideas and innovation, because probably almost everyone in this room has been to about 20 innovation conferences and is familiar with a lot of the prescriptions. So how have you gone about it differently, and what are some of the big ideas that you have that you don't think have been sort of done to death?
I can start with that. One of the first things we did was look at all of the recommendations that had come out before to see sort of where we had been, what had been recommended. So we didn't recommend the same things if they didn't work. So we would look and see. A lot of the time we found a lot of really good recommendations and then no follow-up on them. So that was a really big part of our approach, was to figure out how are we going to measure it, how are we going to make sure that it's either successful or not, so that the next time we write this report or someone else writes this report, there's different recommendations. So that was a really big part. And I think Mike can talk more to some of the other parts of it.
Yeah, that was a big focus of ours. So there was an Alan Rock report from about 2002, which is fantastic. A lot of great ideas around innovation. I think there were 18 ideas, 17 of which I literally felt like I could take that, cross one of the ideas out and submit that today, and everyone would have said, oh, Mike, that's fantastic, that's great work. But if we look at it, our innovation performance, as Dave Waters said this morning, has gone down and down and down and down. So we kept thinking, okay, well, how can we avoid falling into that trap? And I think there's a couple things that we did. Is first, just be different, come up with a different set of ideas, but very practical. So you get a lot of ideas out there in past reports that say, well, Canada needs to be a world leader in X, Y, and Z. Okay, but who does that? Like, whose desk does that fall on? Who's responsible for that? How do you measure that? So we made a conscious effort for every single idea to say, okay, this guy's responsible, this is a person that's going to be held accountable, this is what success looks like, or this is what failure looks like. So I'm hoping that will sort of uncrack that nut of, instead of being sort of vague and general about things, being very, very specific and precise, so that way we know whether or not we've actually accomplished these things.
Would you like to walk us through some of your recommendations?
I would love to. So actually, building on your last conversation on the couch, my background is library science, and so I jumped into the data stuff. So looking at open data, research data management to make sure that the data that our tri-council is funding and other councils are funding actually is saved. I've talked to so many professors that when you ask them where their research data is, they sort of point to a filing cabinet or a computer that's sitting in the corner unplugged and dusty because it's no longer being used, and they don't actually know where their data is. And if we're spending all of this money for innovation on collecting this data, and then it goes missing, or in other situations, it's just not shared. So you also get a lot of professors and researchers that sort of hoard their data. It's theirs. They don't want anyone else to use it because they spent all the time collecting it. But that's not how innovation happens, because then each time the company has to go out and collect that data again or do those experiments, and that's not a level playing field for companies. Big companies can do that. Your small and medium enterprise can't. So we end up with less innovation. So one of my big recommendations was having a program in place, having people responsible for making sure that the research data is managed properly, it's opened so that everyone can use it, depersonalized so that we're not breaking any laws, we're not exposing people, but really getting that data out there for everyone to use.
Well, I tend to think of this issue in terms of bottlenecks. What are the bottlenecks to innovation? And in the report, we talk about a variety of market failures, of regulatory failures, and we also talk about risk aversion, which is not a mark it a regulatory failure, but it can amplify the effects of. You know, most of innovation involves spillover effects, positive externalities, but if you're risk averse, you don't do anything, there's no positive externalities there. So I see risk aversion as being a problem. Now, historically, the federal government goes, okay, you know, Canada's really risk averse, so let's just de-risk everything for companies or organizations. So, you know, we'll assume the risks and they don't. But I think of this thing, you know, like a parent. I mean, Hannah and I have a 5-year-old who tends to be a little bit anxious about things. And there's 2 ways that we can deal with it. So if, you know, she's afraid of spiders, let's say, we can just remove all the spiders. Or, you know, you can have these sort of controlled things to get people sort of used to that, you know, take away that fear. I think that the federal government needs to change the culture more. So instead of just trying to de-risk everything, actually reward risk-taking or get us used to taking risks. So one of the ways we suggested to do that is to copy X prizes. That Canada could do something like Canada 150 prizes. You know, we have a prime minister who is many things, including a salesman-in-chief, to go out there and stake the world, say, okay, you know what? These are the 10 priorities or 15 priorities that we want as a nation. We don't know who's going to solve these, but we really want people, we really want to encourage people to take these risks, to take these leaps, to try and solve these things. You know, here are things that are important social problems that we could be world leaders in. So an example might be, okay, you know, we've got all these boil water risks, advisories, thank you, all over First Nations. Well, why don't we have a Canada 150 prize that is about, okay, you know what, we want to develop a system that costs under a certain amount of money, doesn't require electricity, and could, you know, clean so many liters per minute. You know, you could set the standards, talk to a bunch of experts and say, okay, this is, you know, here's the criteria we want to hit. The first group in Canada that hits that, you get $25 million. And I think not only would we solve a bunch of really important problems, but we would change the conversation. Instead of de-risking everything, we would change the culture and actually encourage risk-taking.
Another one of your ideas involves a new officer of parliament. That threw me for a loop.
So that's building on my stuff. So in Washington, I did a lot of work into coherence and the fact that we often have policies that they contradict each other. And our idea was that if we had someone in Parliament, we called him, I believe, him or her, the Parliamentary Coherence Officer, and an office that would be responsible for looking at policies and not changing policies, but identifying places where policies are either incoherent with each other or there's the possibility of friction, so that we can start to remove and get MPs involved in removing these incoherent policies so that innovation can happen. A lot of our report really focuses on removing barriers to innovation, and incoherent policies are definitely one of them.
Already it's clear that the approach you're taking to innovation is different from the approach that so often gets taken, which is we need to have tech transfer offices on campuses and things like that. Where do you think earlier approaches to innovation have been off track or been misguided?
I think there's a couple areas. So first would be coherence, that we would put in all these new policies, but not really think through how they fit with the existing policy suite. So now, you know, we've got like 60 some odd different funding programs, you know, some of which are somewhat at odds with each other. So I think that's part of it. But a large portion, again, I think is just sort of a lack of responsibility. We're great in general of generating ideas. We're horrible at commercializing them, and I think that's both in the private sector and in the government sector. We're kind of great at saying, okay, well, you know, let's be world leaders here. Let's have these tech trans officers. We fail at implementation, and I think one of the reasons why we fail at implementation, again, is we lack measurable results, we lack accountability, we're not sure who can do things. You know, some of that's unavoidable, like the financial space, because you have both the federal government and the provincial government in there because of the Constitution. So there are, you know, areas where that's naturally going to be complicated, but areas where, you know, we can do something about it, I think we should.
I have a slightly different answer, and we are still married, and we still agree on most things. But for me, it was really being careful not to fall into the trap of innovation equals technology. That we were trying to look, and it's a very easy trap to fall into because there is so much technology that is necessary for innovation. But that's not the only thing that we can focus on. Otherwise, we get stuck innovating just one technology as opposed to changing the culture to be more innovative.
There's two criteria that you introduced early on that you want to guide the kinds of innovation that you're hoping to advance. One is that it be economically inclusive, the other is that it be autonomy enhancing. Can you define those two terms and explain why you decided that they were important? And then finally, how do you think they can be promoted?
Yeah, so you know, the economic inclusion, you know, we're hearing a fair bit from the federal government as well as the Growth Council. So it's just making sure that the gains from innovation don't go to the 1%, don't basically go to business school graduates, but are broadly shared. And I think the Growth Council has recognized that, so they talk about, you know, average family income should go up by $15,000 by 2030, which seems like a reasonable target. So I think that there's broad agreement on that. But on the second one, I think is in fact more important, because you get into this sort of existential thing of, well, why do we want families to have more money? Like, what's the sort of goal? Because the goal in life isn't so much just asset accumulation, but it's feeling contentment. It's, you know, getting people, you know, basically feeling like they have control over their lives. And if we look at things like Brexit, what came up again and again and again of Brexit was the fact that, you know, people just felt like they lost control, particularly in the north of England, that they no longer had control over their lives. The issues there weren't economic, and in fact, you know, the EU and the British government had pumped all kinds of money into the north, and it actually made it worse. It actually made it worse because you turn these people into a charity case. So that's my fear here, that if we basically define all of this in dollars and cents terms, that the answer will become, well, okay, these people aren't benefiting from innovation, so let's just sort of buy them off. And I think that's dangerous. So we talk about autonomy enhancing, that innovation should give people more choice, and it should give communities more stake in economic outcomes. So we have a variety of ideas around this. One was adopted from the state of California, making it easier for average, everyday people to invest in local businesses. You know, right now there's all kinds of regulatory barriers that prevent that. You know, so open that up. Another one is if you're in a small community, you know, you're a 20-year-old, you work at a drugstore in a small community, it's really hard for you to get a job somewhere else, to get a job in Toronto or Ottawa or wherever you live close to, because you can't afford, you know, you can't commute there, but you can't afford the real estate because house prices are $1 million. So figuring out a way to increase transit between cities, so that way, you know, you could continue, you know, you could continue living in rural Ontario, or, you know, suburban Ontario, but take a job in Toronto or Ottawa in a big sector. But it's just basically finding ways to give people and communities more control over their own economic destiny.
Okay. Does that, are you implying that that's a smart place for infrastructure investments to go? Is that the sort of thing you're talking about? Or?
Yeah, so partly it would be infrastructure, that it focus on not just transit sort of within cities, but transit throughout cities. So again, that would be part of it. But as well, just giving communities more tools to investment. So, you know, some of that would be a devolution to cities and other communities to give them more options when making spending decisions. Again, these ideas about making it easier for small businesses and small communities to access capital. So one of the ideas that we have is a finance matching portal. So you have a small business, you have some kind of interesting idea, you can apply to this portal, you get vetted by the government, and as long as, you know, this doesn't look like a fraud or a Ponzi scheme or something like that, you have your idea on there, but then you can also sign up as a potential investor. So it's basically, I wanted to call it, Canada 2020 wouldn't let me call this, but it basically thinking like Tinder for finance. But that kind of matching system, again, which give people more power, because there's all kinds of people throughout Canada that have a fantastic idea that angel investors might be interested in, but they don't know any angel investors. They've never met an angel investor. They don't even know how to get started. This would be a way for them to be able to get matched up with people that they would normally never have a chance to meet.
You're operating in a fairly crowded field right now in terms of all the consultations that are going on. Kirsty Duncan's got a science consultation led by David Naylor, a science advisory panel. There's the growth panel led by Dominic Barton. It's almost like every ministry's got a panel. Navdeep Bains has the innovation advisory panel. Melanie Joly has a digital culture panel, which overlaps pretty substantially with all the others. As you went across the country talking to people, did you run into signs of consultation fatigue? And did you have trouble sort of carving out your own niche in terms of what you were trying to get done?
Well, I did the numeracy group, and they were just so happy that someone would listen to them talk about math for a couple of hours over coffee that they were hunting me down later, saying, like, can we meet again? So I think, and I found this when I did my PhD research too, I talked to nurses, and they were so used to being overlooked because everyone wanted to talk to the doctors about innovation, that there are some groups that we haven't talked to enough, and they're just so pleased. And I think this is going back to the autonomy enhancing, so pleased that someone will listen to them and take their ideas and their concerns into consideration instead of going to the usual suspects, which Mike did.
Well, yeah, but we did mostly, but we tried not. We tried to be a little bit different, because I was kind of cognizant of that I didn't want to invite all of the same people that the government was inviting. So when we did our tech one, for instance, I invited this guy, Andre Domis, who has this thing called Textdale, and it teaches inner city kids in Rexdale how to do coding. This is the kind of guy that normally doesn't get invited to these things, new voice. Canada 2020, at first thought I lost my mind when I said, you know what, I want to go out to Halifax and I want to talk to a bunch of artists. They're like, why? And I'm like, because they're doing cool things and their voices aren't being heard. And so, that was on the input side. On the output side, I think we have a lot more breathing room. I can come up with some kind of, we could come up with some completely crazy idea, and it doesn't have the government's fingerprints on it. So I think we have more political space to be a little bit interesting, to be a little bit bold, and to contradict things. When I say, you know what, some of these past reports have missed the mark. I'm not sort of criticizing my former colleagues that way, that we have a lot more independence, and I think together we made good use of it, of the fact that we didn't have all these restrictions on us.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor, if there are going to be any, in a couple of minutes. I want to ask Hannah, though, since you talked to the numeracy people and they were so happy to talk to you, what did they tell you then, and how did it work its way into your conclusions?
Well, it was actually quite interesting because I was diagnosed with dyscalculia when I was in first year university, and my father was a math professor. So it was kind of surprising when I was talking to them, and they were saying how we've done a really good job in North America on language development skills, and we identify children very young if they're having problems with language, because we know how important that is as a foundation. And we don't have that for numeracy yet. We have kids get tested in about grade 3, at which point they're already behind. And we have lots of good testing. Everyone has a different test, and everyone has a different solution. And because, going back to my pet project of data, we don't share that data. We can't compare and see which ones are the most effective and put in proper plans and proper ways of, if we have this problem, here's the solution, this is how we fix it. And there are systems out there that can do that. So finding that out, that we're testing too young or too late, that we don't have a curriculum in place to teach kids numbers and the basics the way we do have with language was really, really fascinating and slightly embarrassing because I'm not a great mathematician, so talking to them they're very, very smart people. It was a little intimidating. But their goal right now is to make saying I don't do math or I can't do math just as socially unacceptable as it would be to say, oh, I don't read really well, or reading's not my skill. I don't have the reading gene. We never hear that, but we often hear, oh, I don't have the math gene, and that drives them mad. So it was fascinating.
That's a minefield. I wrote a column about how kids learn math after the EQAO results came out, and the readers of the Toronto Star, as one, jumped down my throat. It was easily the most controversial thing I've written in my 6 months at the Star. There's a question over here. What do you have for us?
Hi. There's been lots of great content about different innovative things in different fields and things, but I'm glad this panel's starting to talk about how do you pay for it. And I don't think there's a lack of ideas in Canada, there's a lack of capital. And since the 1970s and 80s when the banks bought brokerage firms, today through which they manage $1 trillion of investors' money, none of that money is actually put into equities of companies that are innovative, nor whether they're public or private. In a normal portfolio, you would have 5 or 10% of your portfolio in higher risk stuff, which means innovation, and the banks want plain vanilla. The stockbrokers aren't stockbrokers, they're now wealth managers, and they take in the cash and the bank puts it in a model portfolio of safe stuff. And so there's $1 trillion on deposit now through these brokerage firms that can't invest in risk and innovation. And in a normal portfolio, that should be 5 to 10%, and they're managing $1 trillion, so that's $50 billion a year that's not being recycled into innovation. To me, that's one of the biggest problems holding the country back. This is more of a comment, but maybe you'd like to respond. Governments don't have enough money to fix the problem that is out there by lack of capital. The public needs to be given access to the opportunity to invest in these kinds of things.
Yeah, I wholly agree, and that's part of our Finmatch proposal. That first of all, there are all kinds of companies looking for money. They have great ideas, but they don't know who to ask. The big 5 or 6 banks, doesn't necessarily want to touch them. It's different sort of business models. It's not like 40 years ago where you're opening a factory and you have some capital assets. If you're a service firm, you're basically hiring a bunch of people. There's nothing for the bank to repossess after. And full disclosure, I own one of those service companies, and I know exactly what it's like to work with the banks. But at the same time, there's all kinds of sort of retired people, like fairly wealthy people who are tired of holding bonds that are paying off 1.7% for a 30-year bond. They're earning no return. So for me, it's just a matching problem. We've got people who are desperate for yield and people with high yield ideas who are desperate for money. So let's find a way to put them together. It's win-win.
Isn't that a problem that's solving itself to some extent, though, through ad hoc mechanisms like Kickstarter? I mean, serious projects are getting funded on Kickstarter.
Yeah, I think that is now on the equity side's a bit different. Most of the Kickstarter models are kind of like, well, I want to build this cool thing, and you're sort of getting people to prepay for it. Where I think Finmatch is a bit different is in the vetting process, that you would have governments or some agency vetting these ideas, again, not for the quality of ideas, but just not making sure they're a scam, making sure that all the financials are laid out a certain way so you can compare between ideas and ideas and ideas. So that standard setting, I think, is really important, and I think that's why you need government action there, that it's not something that the private sector by itself is going to solve. But absolutely, we are seeing the private sector move into that space.
Another question?
My question is about talent, and I think it's really interesting that both of you that you talked to math people and that you were talking to creativity people, both about innovation. And so I already kind of asked this question this morning, but now I'm asking it of you too. That thinking about that talent idea and where this all begins, if we go back to your kid, and thinking about how we need to change things for math, yes, but it's part of our tendency, I think, that when we think about innovation, we think about technology, then we think about STEM. Are there other things then, if you were designing a new public education system, right now we just measure math, reading, and writing, that you would think of as foundational kind of competencies and skills that we should be focusing on early, so that we have some kind of alignment all the way up, so that when you're thinking about this at sort of downstream, that we've thought it through upstream more?
So from the math perspective, one of the focuses that I focused on was this idea that elementary school teachers in general are quite math phobic. If you become a math teacher, you're usually in the high schools. So one of the goals of our recommendation was to try and increase the time that teachers spend learning math and learning different techniques so that they're not scared of it and they don't pass that on to their students, because you can pick up on a math phobia pretty quickly, and it's amazing what kids replicate from their teachers. I think the same thing would be good for innovation, is having teachers that are innovative. And I don't know if we bring in more innovators to teach classes. I'm sure Shopify could run a kindergarten class for a couple of weeks. But just encouraging that innovation in the education system, both in how they teach and what they teach, and going from there would be a really good start, I think.
I want to reintroduce failure. As someone who's a prof, I have some incredibly bright. I have all my students are incredibly bright, because I know they're watching at home, so I don't want to seem like I'm insulting anyone. But the one thing I noticed about that generation, they've never failed at anything, and they're incredibly risk averse and just fear failure because of it. And innovation involves failure. So my concern is to watching the World Series last night, that we're a nation of slap hitters. We're so afraid of striking out that we're just trying to get the bat on the ball, but we never hit any home runs because of it. I think we need to reintroduce failure young, get some of these kids to swing for the fences and realize that that's going to cause them to strike out every so often, and that's fine.
It's intriguing that all of your metaphors are sports metaphors, because I think the only place where a 10-year-old kid or a 6-year-old kid is going to learn to be utterly humiliated and that that's okay is in sports. And I kind of envy not having been super athletic as a kid, but I kind of envy the kids who let a puck go right by them into the net and then have to save the rest of the game and things like that, because the academic equivalents are, you're right, I think, are less frequent, And you have to learn that really screwing up big time is not a bad thing. Up at Makerspace North, the sort of tech innovator entrepreneurial hub that is here in Ottawa, they have an occasional event called, I hesitate to say it in front of a family crowd, fuck up nights, where entrepreneurs get up and and this is a worldwide phenomenon. They have these meetings around the world periodically. Entrepreneurs get up and they describe the most humiliating failure of their careers so far, and then everyone has a beer, so that people can get used to the idea that that's okay. That's part of the whole process. I find it a very intriguing kind of worldwide movement, and probably a pretty fun night. Another question up here. What's that? Oh, yes. I will be happy to take a question from this side, which I've just learned exists. Sir.
You're turned your back on this side.
It's only because now it'll be so much more exciting that you're getting to ask a question, sir.
Okay. Well, I think a very practical problem was brought up that we need, how shall I say, low rental housing and easy commute, shall I say. The problem comes in that setup, as I see it, is always, at least in Toronto, that's what is happening, and I'm sure it's probably in the other cities, that we don't have money for transit. That's the biggest sort of hurdle. It seems like our politicians are tax averse in a way. What I would say is that right now, at least I will quote all Toronto statistics, that 90% of the traffic in Toronto is one person per car. And most of them, they are driving 4x4s, SUVs, and all the others. Now, what the heck are they driving those huge cars for? And causing a congestion on the road and pollution on the air and climate change and everything else. So I think the easiest solution, in my opinion, is anyway, that the cars, like we have progressive income tax, we should be having a progressive gas tax. If you drive a bigger car, they should be taxed more. And if you tax them more, we'll have money for transit. And if they start driving small cars, we'll have room for bike lanes and less congestion. Now, these are simple ideas, but I think the politicians are so afraid to upset the fat-ass car drivers that they don't want to even touch it. And, you know, let's not just look at innovation at technical end of things, but there is a problem of innovation at the political end of things. And our politicians have to smarten up.
He may have a point. Although I do think we've got a government that is grasping that nettle fairly aggressively through a carbon tax, but transit and transport as feeders into an innovation system.
Well, I think the policy coherence officer, our parliamentary coherence officer, could really help with that, because they could start to identify where things are in contradiction, that we're trying to deal with climate change, yet we've got low gas taxes. I'm from Europe, so I think they're quite low. So identifying those problems and where those things are in contradiction is, I think, the first step.
Another question from my favorite microphone.
Yes, thank you.
I'm facing this way.
That's why I came to this microphone, because I knew it was your favorite. So I have a theory that it'd be much better for people to finish their math education in grade 10 with an A+, instead of in grade 12 with whatever grade they get. So brainstorm for me, let's see how intelligent you are on the spot, Finmatch for education, which won't upset the system too much, that can actually work, like within the political system. So Finmatch for education, right? A way for someone to come up with this idea and deploy it somewhere in Canada to innovate the way education works. Math is my thing. How would that work? How would Finmatch for education work in a way that policymakers would actually buy into it?
So do you mean how would we change math education so that we could do this?
Yes, or how would... Back to the favorite microphone. Yeah, how would you build, like, he was talking about building a Finmatch system. What would the matching system between the innovative idea and the implementation exist so that it could actually get off the ground?
Well, I haven't thought of that before. But I think the larger issue I think is that we don't do enough sort of policy experiments in the schools. And I just say the word experiment in school, term experiment in schools, and half of people recoil. But I do think we do need to try some things, and some of our school boards are. But as Hannah discovered, there's a lack of data sharing. There's a lack of information sharing. Some of these experiments are done kind of similarly but different ways, so the results aren't comparable. So I think these things need to happen where we try a bunch of things, see what works, and can kind of deploy those best practices.
Just a programming note. That we're waiting on the next guest, so this session here is going to go into extra innings. We're just going to stay up here until you all start innovating. Fair warning.
Big idea 11. Nobody leaves this room until they come up with 3 innovations.
It's an innovation cage match. Next question over here.
My name is Jennifer Flanagan from Actua, and my question is about inclusivity and this much discussed inclusive innovation agenda. So I would love to hear from you about how the topic of broadening diversity in the innovation ecosystem how was it discussed, and whether there were any concrete ideas that came out for how we're going to actually get more diverse voices around the table.
I can start that, and then Mike can continue on. But for us, a lot of it was removing the barriers, because a lot of those barriers are they're not intentional, but they really do block off anyone new from a system, new from an innovation area. The lack of data, if you're not a senior research professor at a university, the chances that if you email someone to get their data from them, that they're going to respond. I tried when I was at Harvard, and I had the Harvard name in my title, and I still got, well, read my research report in the journals. And I went into the journals, and there was a little bit of data there, but I needed more, and I responded back, and he said, you can get it when you get tenure. So removing those barriers by just saying, you know what, if we fund your research, you bloody well have to put it into the research data management system where everyone can access it, is a really good way to just get rid of all of that. So I think a lot of getting the open data will really impact things that we don't really expect.
So one of the big ideas that we haven't talked about that we had in this was the idea of cluster research centers. So the idea would be, let's say we decide that one of our big priorities is agri-food in southwestern Ontario. I'm just deciding it on our behalf. So we put a cluster research center in say, Chatham, Kent, and which would be, would have to have an annual meeting, bring in stakeholders and all these things. And what I would want the center to do is identify companies or organizations who are increasing diversity as a best practice. What exactly are they doing? You know, so highlight the best practices, and you know, maybe we have to name and shame some companies that aren't doing that. But it's crazy to me that in this country, you know, we have talent shortages all over the place. Yet we have all of these communities, again, so we have the kids from Rexdale, you know, the farm girl from Whalen's Corners. I bet someone $50 I'd make a Whalen's Corners reference, and here we go. But all of these groups, First Nations groups, that are completely excluded, like just, they're not given a chance because they don't live in the right neighborhood, they don't have the right socioeconomic background, and so on. So again, it's win-win solutions. You know, you've got companies that are desperate for talent, and you've got kids all over the place desperate for an opportunity. Let's find innovative ways, and again, we can do this through the research center, highlight best practices, go, okay, this, you know, company X is doing a really interesting thing of, you know, getting more First Nations talents, getting more kids from rural areas in these companies, and just give them a chance. And I think if we give more of these kids a chance, many of them would surprise us.
Okay, I'm just checking. I'm just checking my logistical situation. I think we're fine. This data information management system, this sort of data trunk that everyone has to feed, is there an existing system in place that could handle this, or would it have to be created de novo? Who would run it?
Well, a lot of it's done ad hoc. Different universities have different systems in place. I'm a librarian at heart, so I would like to see, you know, Canada National Data Library or something to that equivalency. I'm not sure the universities are quite ready for that kind of shakeup. The US is doing something very similar, and a couple of years ago, they simply said, if you get federal funding, you have to share your data. And you can decide how that is. There are a couple of recommended platforms, but every university has to make sure that all the data is shared. And it's amazing what happens if you withhold money and suddenly say, you know what, I know you want $50 million for this, but you're gonna have to share your data with everyone else. And they do. They fight it, but they do it. So it's a bit of a stick approach, but librarians are actually pretty good at forcing people to do things.
So it occurs to me that maybe the Library of Parliament could run this big new data shop. They're losing the parliamentary budget officer who was announced this week. So maybe as a consolation prize, they could get all of the data in Canada.
It's a pretty good consolation prize. I pictured the Library and Archives, but Library of Parliament might be good too.
One more question.
Hi, I'm not.
There's a question over there. Hey, let's go over here. Okay, let's do that. I take all my instructions from Tim Barber, as does everyone. We've got a couple more minutes left. We'll take each of these questions, and then we'll aggregate them and answer them together. So, question over here, and then a question over here, and then we'll throw it to you guys.
Okay. My question is about social innovation and how it relates to the more technological and commercial kind of innovation you've been discussing. I'm with Genome Canada, and one of the things we know from funding both genomics research and also social science and humanities research alongside it, is that you can have all the technological innovation you want in coming up with great new genomics tests and processes, but if there's not also the willingness in government and nonprofits to adopt these things, the protocols, to do genetic counseling, to communicate what the value of these new things might be, it won't be taken up. It won't be, the technological innovation won't be effective. So the broader question is, to what extent have you found the concept of social innovation useful in the consultations you've done? Is it worth pairing with the more traditional notion of innovation, or have you found that it's fairly separate concepts that are best addressed separately?
That's question one, and question two is?
You've been talking, I think it was Mike that was talking about the fact that we had an implementation problem. Basically, we were very good at bringing up ideas and innovating, but not very much at implementing into the... So how do you foster greater demand for innovation within either private or public organizations? Have you been looking at these questions?
Okay, they're not unconnected questions.
I can talk to the social innovation a little bit. So I did a PhD in information systems, and I looked at how nurses used or didn't use technology. And it was fascinating to see how much social innovation had to happen before we could even think about using the technology. So there is definitely, we have a problem with social innovation. After talking to the math people and being slightly embarrassed by my math skills, tried to come up with an equation for innovation, and it never got particularly far, but it did involve sort of technical innovation plus social innovation equals true innovation, something along that line. But I see them working together, but if we ignore one, the other's gonna kill us in the end.
So on the point about implementation, I almost take the same approach that Dominic Barton probably would, in the sense that I would take sort of a McKinsey, Bain consulting firm approach, that where these things tend to fall apart, where implementation tends to fall apart is where there's not a smart objective. So smart objective is something that's timely, is measurable, that kind of thing. And I think, I think that's where a lot of this falls apart, that, we have this, our goal is to be best in class in some area by 2020. Well, again, whose job is that? What resources are we going to put into it? So I think in order to get that implementation, we have to be very specific, very precise, and very accountable. That, okay, this is this particular agency's job or this minister's job, and this is what success looks like. You either do it or don't. I think that would go a long way to make sure that these things are implemented.
Okay. On that note, we'll wrap it up. Thanks to both of you for coming from far off London, Ontario. It's always really good to see a broader definition, both of the innovation challenge and of the mechanisms that are available to address it.